Today, we will hear a review of Tara Westover's memoir, Educated. And I'd like to share just one paragraph from a review of Educated, which appeared in the June 18, 2018 issue of The New Yorker. This story, remarkable as it is, might be merely another entry in the subgenre of extreme American life, were it not for the uncommon perceptiveness of the person telling it. Westover examines her childhood with unsparing clarity, and more startlingly, with curiosity and love, even for those who have seriously failed or wronged her. In part, this is a book about being a stranger in a strange land. Westover, adrift at university, can't help but miss her mountain home. But her deeper subject is memory. Westover is careful to note the discrepancies between her own recollections and those of her relatives. If her book is an act of defiance, a way to set the record of her own life straight, it is also an attempt to understand, even to respect, those whom she had to break away from in order to get free. Our presenter today is Dr. Daniel DeMarle, President and Education Specialist of DeMarle, Inc. And please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
All right, just checking everybody can hear me. If you can hear me. And then you wonder why some people don't raise their hands. So thanks everybody for coming today. And just for my information, how many people have actually read the book? Okay. So for those who haven't read it yet, when you get a chance, you're going to have a delightful read. It's a wonderfully written book. Very briefly, it covers the story of Tara Westover, who's growing up in a Mormon family in Idaho. She is her family is off the grid for a big part of the book. They homeschool their children, mostly the older boys. By the time she gets to school age, there's not a lot of homeschooling going on. Her father runs a scrap metal business, and all the children are required at a certain age to work at the scrap metal business, which results in lots of injuries, including herself, and some very serious injuries. She and three of her brothers make it a way to college, and then part of the book is her story about going to college, finding out what she doesn't know, discovering, for example, what the Holocaust was when she asks a question about it during her freshman class, and everybody stares at her because they think she made a joke about the Holocaust. And then, because she has specific skills, some that came directly from her family, she's able to go off, and she goes off to England, to Cambridge, and then to Harvard, gets her PhD, and manages to survive. Now, that's the synopsis of the book for people who haven't read it yet. So the wonderful thing about Educated is there's so many things you can talk about, so many particular topics. Now, of course, myself, I'm an education specialist. So when kids have bipolar disorder, ADHD, or adults, OCD, depression, anxiety disorders, they come to see me so I can sort out what's going on. And for those who've read the book, and this is spoiler alerts for people who haven't read the book, you're going to find out that her father, she believes, has bipolar disorder. And that it makes everything more complicated for them. So looking at all those possible topics and how can I discuss them in a fairly brief period of time, I focused on the idea of belief. What does she believe? What does her family believe? What does her family believe about her? What does she believe about her family? What do they believe about the state and the government? And all those complicated beliefs. Because she was primarily just in her home other than going to church on Sundays. All of her beliefs came from what she was seen and shown in her house until she actually leaves. So it's a complicated story of belief in her case. So looking at those, because what we have is we have Tara, who am I? And then we have all of these belief systems. What's the role of the church? In this case, the Mormon church. What's the role of the state? The federal government, the state government. For people who read the book, you know that when the federal government raids the Weaver camp, the Weaver family, that tragedy that happened, that's a huge change point in her entire family's life. And the government, the federal government, is seen as that will come in and take them away. And take them away. What's the role of medicine? Because they don't take any medicine. She takes her first aspirin, I think when she's 17, because she's been told that medicine will poison your soul. So, and is totally impressed that it can actually make her earache go away, because she's always been treated just with her mother's her mother's botanical treatments and tinctures and oils. A huge theme is the patriarchy. In this case, and for myself, I was raised one of 8. So she's one of 7, and I'm one of 8. So in my family, I was just telling a joke. We ended up with 4 boys and 4 girls. So except in my family, the girls were on top because they were the oldest, and the boys came later. The boys, in her case, came first. The girls came later. Now, what was complicated is that in her family system, the actual power was God. And then God gave his power to her father. And what's the role of polygamy? Because in the Mormon faith, a wife always has the threat of, I can get another one. Even though it's not practiced right now in the Mormon faith, it's still on the books. So God has the ultimate power, who translates that power to the father. So if you're disagreeing with your father, you're also disagreeing with God. And your mother can have a second mother, or a third mother, or a fourth mother. Then what's the role of a woman? A huge part of this story is her relationship with her mother and her father and her siblings. And for people who read it, there's a remarkable thing that happens at the beginning of the book. And essentially, that's when her mother gets trained to be a midwife. And suddenly the power dynamic in the family shifts. They had no phone. And suddenly, because her mother became a midwife, they got a phone. And the dad just accepted it. Her dad was pushing very hard for her mother to become a midwife. And when that happened, the whole power dynamic shifted in the relationship, until her mother had her traumatic brain injury, and then it kind of went back again. Okay. What's the role of education? For her, education was totally freeing once she finally got it. Once she was able to get out in the wider world and see what she had been taught wasn't what was really going on in the world. Although that was a very bumpy road for her to make that transition from where she was and what she understood to what was really out there, even taking medicine. And then you had, of course, that very complicated father-daughter relationship, because her father was the be-all and end-all, and as people who read the book know, he loved to preach to his family and go on long, long diatribes around how women were whores. They would come home from church, and he would comment on how somebody's skirt was here, or maybe here, and that they were a whore because of that. And one of the things that comes around in the book is her belief that she's a whore. The very first time she's on a date, if you could call it a date. The very first time she's on a date, and he tries to hold her hand, and she has a physical reaction of almost electric shock and pain because she's been taught through her family that a woman's body is evil. That showing any skin, anything, makes you a whore. So those are her beliefs, and she's growing in this system. Now, I had discerned the ways in which we had been sculpted by a tradition given to us by others, a tradition of which we were either willfully or accidentally ignorant. I had begun to understand that we had lent our voices to a discourse whose sole purpose was to dehumanize and brutalize others, because nurturing that discourse was easier, because retaining power always feels like the way forward, which is a great political commentary for today's world, by the way. And I would add, brutalize others and ourselves, because as children, they were pretty brutalized in this family. Then once she starts to learn, once she finally gets away from the family, her beliefs start to change. I evolved a new understanding of the word whore, one that was less about actions and more about essence. It was not that I had done something wrong so much as that I existed in the wrong way. There was something impure in the fact of my being. Now that's before she got educated. It took a long time for her to change that opinion, that just being a woman was bad, that being a woman was actually something good. Now, one of the big conflicts in the book is the family's relationship to the government. Okay? Now, I like the first part here, which is why I pulled this quote. The role of the national government is to protect the safety and well-being of its citizens. Now, I'm going to come back to that because her father was totally against the government. For people who haven't read it, and people who have, remember, she didn't even have a birth certificate until she was 9. She had no legal status in the United States. If some of those accidents happened today, ICE could have picked up the 4 youngest children because they had no documentation that they were legal U.S. citizens. They could have been deported. They had nothing that said they were U.S. citizens. Her mother couldn't even remember her birth date. At one point, her father threatens to throw them out, and she has to remind her mother she's only 16. And then it's like, oh, you're only 16? Okay, I guess you can stay. You're too young for us to throw you out. Now, one concept that some people may have picked on, she grew up living in a criminal organization. I mean, how many laws did they break in this family? So, clearly, there was a lot of child endangerment. The number of injuries that occurred. And if CPS had been called, they would have been taken away. They would have been placed in foster homes. All right? Now, there wasn't any... It's hard to say child abuse. It's hard to say child neglect, but there's clearly a lot of child endangerment. They were huge violations of child labor laws. So one of the roles of government is to protect us. And she started working full-time, 9 to 5, as I think a 10-year-old in a scrapyard. And all of her older siblings were their father's crew, meaning that they were working on building barns and everything else when they were still preteens or teens. Her mother, in terms of midwifery, at that time it was illegal in Idaho. So whether it should be is a whole other question, but at that time it was, I don't know if it still is, but it was illegal in Idaho. So her mother was blatantly breaking the law and then brought her to help with a birth, which again, if that's actually, I think, great, but it was in violation of the law, and her mother had her help commit a crime of delivering a baby, and coached her on what to say if they got raided by the FBI or the state when that happened, if it happened. Now, the 4 youngest children were not. There's no paperwork. Now, actually, if they had claimed the children in their taxes, because remember, they did actually pay taxes at some point, because at one point she had to go get tax forms from them. So they did seem to pay taxes. They would have gotten those deductions for the kids, but they weren't legally existing anywhere. And who knows what they were actually doing with their taxes. The environmental, I mean, do you think Dad was following all the environmental rules about all the oil and gas that he was taking out of those scrap cars and everything else when he was melting stuff? I mean, it sounds to me like they totally poisoned the land they were living on. All right. OSHA would have had a field day. OSHA would have shut them down. In fact, that's one of the ways her brother Sean, who actually was telling his dad, listen, we need to get a bucket loader so I can actually stand in a bucket when we're up high. We need to get actual guide ropes so we can be safe. And of course, then he falls and injures himself and has a brain injury. I was working at RGH, and at one point they were doing expansion, and they're building this new piece. And I looked out the window, and all the construction workers are up on the beams with no safety lines. And so I called. I said, hey, by the way, you guys are hiring these people. They're right outside. There's no safety lines. The very next day, they all had safety lines. It's easier not to have the guidelines until you fall. And then once they start the sale of all their tinctures and tonics, there's that wonderful line where her dad's on the phone telling people that not to take their diabetes medicine, just to take their stuff. That's practicing medicine without a license. So her family, the family she grew up in, had multiple violations of the law, and they were raised in this culture where that was perfectly fine because the government was out to get you. So why did this happen? So what we know is that there were a number of serious either developmental disabilities or mental health disorders. So her father certainly seems to have had an undiagnosed or untreated bipolar disorder. Of course, you can't diagnose a fictional person. And I don't actually diagnose people, I just help people come up with treatment plans. But there were the times when he was manic. Remember that for people who haven't read it, at one point he was going to make the biggest snowball in the world. And he had all the kids excited about making the biggest snowball in the world. And then he had the periods where he moved into deep depression. That's when they went on their road trips to Arizona for the sun treatment. And that pattern, that cycle of kind of manic, when he first got the snippers, where Luke got injured, he was so excited about that. He was so manic about using this thing. And then these intermixed periods where he became catatonic. So one of the things that happens, anybody here have any family members with OCD? Anybody had those really picky eaters as kids, who would only eat certain things? And what happens is that when you have, let's say, OCD, your kid will only eat this food. Or if you don't stop 3 times on that stop before you come into the room, there's going to be a major temper tantrum. What happens is the whole family accommodates to the disorder. Parents will be making 3 dinners. There's 2 kids who will only eat certain things. They won't eat the same things. And then everybody else is going to eat this. So the parents are literally cooking dinners to accommodate around. And so you had this whole family that was raised in a toxic environment based on dad's bipolar disorder. And if you're bipolar, there are times where it may be years between episodes, and there are times where it may be months between episodes. There's times when you can tell episodes are coming because it's kind of like the hurricane's coming in and the waves start getting bigger. So you're raised in this thing where you never quite know what's going to happen. There's a constant level of unpredictability living with bipolar disorder. Then, after they go south to Arizona for the first time, Dad becomes catatonic. Then, of course, the car accident. And her mother suffers that severe brain injury where she had to be in the basement for like 6 months or something. And that ended the midwifery for a while until she healed enough. And, of course, as she says, Mom was never the same since. So she's got a father with bipolar and a mother with a severe brain injury. Now, Luke, one of her older brothers, had a severe learning disability, probably dyslexia. And her mother spent so much time trying to teach him to read, that's one of the reasons she didn't have as much time to work with everybody else, besides the fact that Dad kept trying to grab the kids to get them out into work, get them away from schooling to go work. And then Tyler, of course, had that severe stutter. Sean, I'm not quite sure, other than the fact that he had at least 3 brain injuries during the course of the book. The fall off the ladder, the motorcycle accident. I believe there's one other time. I don't remember the exact one. And then, of course, we had all these physical injuries as the kids got banged up pretty badly and burnt. Now, remember that slide about government? So, the role of government to protect. So, because her parents didn't want anything to do with the government, the kids paid a severe price. So, because nobody ever turned them into CPS, they had to continue in this abusive situations. And for people who read the book, the whole issue with Sean and Sean's abuse of her, you always wonder if there was some actual sexual abuse in there too, or maybe not for her, maybe her older sister, but it's never stated. That then drives the whole wedge between her and the family, so she finally has to decide, am I going to be a member of this family or not? And her sister makes the other decision to pass it all over so she can still be a member of the family. If Child Protective had been involved, and it was interesting because a couple months before I read this book, there was an article about a similar family where the oldest daughter got out, and then she actually turned her family into CPS because she was the one raising all the younger kids. You know, she was giving 5 kids a bath at the same time. And that after she turned them into CPS, she found out that the kids were all going to school. Now, that never happened here. Then, Luke, with his severe learning disability, could have gotten, because this is in the 80s, after Public Law 94-142 was passed, the law that requires special education services for students, could have had specialized reading instruction. He could have actually had services for a severe learning disability. And his life may have been ultimately different if he had actually had somebody who could teach him to read and write. Because he was limited because he ended up with just a GED, which is an accomplishment. I'm using just a GED. But he was probably just as smart as all of his other siblings, but he couldn't read. So his life would have been ultimately different if he had received some services. If Sean had gotten some mental health services early in his life, I know his wife's life would have been much different. Then, in terms of special ed, if Tyler had gotten some speech-language therapy for that stutter, if somebody had actually worked with him on his stutter, would have made a nice difference for him in his life. Let alone, issues around ADHD and all those other issues that go along. And there's also the question of Sean may have bipolar disorder, but there's not enough data to say. Clearly, if there had been more effective medical services, her father may have kept the use of his hand or not after the fire. I think the one who had his leg burnt might have not had that limp later in his life. And let alone if they all had education, and for the ones who struggled with reading, if they had job training other than what they got on the job with their dad. So their parents' refusal to have anything to do, their belief that education was bad, that government services were bad, all had lasting impacts on the kids. The kids' lives could have been different if indeed they had been able to get those services. So back to the point about education, because in some ways, her dad was right. He did not trust the government. And ultimately, the government failed them, failed the kids. So one of the things under special education law is called child find. School districts are supposed to look for kids with disabilities because there are lots of parents who choose to homeschool or not provide services for their kids. I've got homeschoolers in my practice. We have lots of homeschoolers. Of course, they're the ones who are willing to come get help. There's lots of homeschoolers who won't come to see me because I'll try to hook them up with government services and get their kids help. Now, and if you're homeschooling, at least in New York State, you have to submit paperwork to the school district to go over what you're actually teaching your kids. So at some level, the school district failed. I would be very interested to see their taxes, state and federal taxes for what they claimed or didn't claim. So somehow those got through, okay? Of course, she was a kid, so all those 2 car accidents, kids with no seatbelts, no insurance, no current registration, somehow it just disappeared. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe there were consequences, but she didn't know about them. But clearly there were times when the judicial system could have been involved and could have made a difference in these kids' lives as kids. And then, there are some, as my very intelligent wife reminds me all the time, not every town zones. Not everybody has the same zoning requirements, but their zoning must have been a disaster if their town even zoned. What was it? Mixed use, residential, mixed use? I mean, what exactly would that have been? So we had government agencies, federal and state and local, plus school districts. Now, these people were trying to hide from all of these systems, but they exist to intervene in situations like this. So was he wrong? Because he did not have faith in the government, and ultimately you could also argue the other way, that the government failed them. That the government could have come in and made a difference in these kids' lives. You could argue that Tara turned out well, that she got out of the family, that she got out. Obviously, there was some deep depression there while she was working on her PhD. That definitely impacted her. So obviously, it didn't come out with no cost. But what about Sean's kids? We know he was abusive. We know he's manipulative. He's got 2 kids. What's going on with them? Are they safe? Is his wife safe? And if his wife was seeing medical care, then those nurses would be asking questions about, are you safe in your home? Do you feel safe? Do you have a plan? How can we get you out of this situation? Because what we do know is when she did go to her in-laws after he threw her out in sub-0 degree temperature with no shoes on, what did they do? They called him and told him to come pick her up. So her reaching out to her family for support was not helpful to his family for support. In part because of that, going back, belief structure. The belief, so Their belief structure is God says the husband has these powers and everything defers to the husband. When she tries at the end to get her mother to talk to her, after, of course, the whole thing about her mother saying, I agree, I didn't protect you, and all those things, her mother's response is, I can't go against your father. I'm cutting you off because you cut your father off. That my belief in his role in this family is greater than my relationship to you. So Tara, through all of this, is looking at how is she becoming a person when she has in her family all of these different roles telling her she has to be something she's not comfortable being as she grows and learns. Which leads to the last quote before we open for discussion. Everything I had worked for, all my years of study, had been to purchase for myself this one privilege, to see and experience more truths than those given to me by my father, and to use those truths to construct my own mind. I had come to believe that the ability to evaluate many ideas, many histories, many points of view was at the heart of what it means to self-create. If I yielded now, I would lose more than an argument. I would lose custody of my own mind. This was the price I was being asked to pay. I understood that now. What my father wanted to cast for me wasn't a demon. It was me. So by becoming educated, it gives her the power to say, I don't have those same beliefs. I have a different definition of myself than what you believed of me. And that came at a great cost to her. Now, she made up for it by selling a best-selling book, which is awesome. But it was a painful process. So, going to open it up for questions. Are we set?